What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest on this episode of Hidden Forces is Anne Stevenson-Yang, the founder of J Capital Research, which publishes highly diligenced research reports on overvalued, publicly traded companies with a particular focus on China, and is also the author of several books on China, its economy, and its political system, including Hello Kitty and Wild Ride, a short history of the opening and closing of the Chinese economy. The first hour of our conversation today is a discussion about the history of the Chinese economic miracle, as seen through the eyes of someone who experienced those changes firsthand. Anne and I discussed the early phases of liberalization, beginning in the 1980s, the political crackdown and subsequent rapid growth of the 1990s, and how the Asian financial crisis at the beginning of that decade set the scene for the go-go years of the early 2000s, culminating in the Beijing Summer Olympics and the 2008 financial crisis, which was, in many ways, a crisis enabled by the trade and capital imbalances of China's export-driven growth model and rapid economic integration into the global economy. In the second hour, we explore the China that has emerged under the leadership of Xi Jinping and why Anne believes that this represents a dark turn for the country. We discuss the enduring impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on China's economy, on the psychology of its people, and how it showcased the Communist Party's systems of surveillance, including their social credit system, which has its own analog in the form of Western social media and surveillance companies. If you want access to that part of the conversation and you're not already subscribed to Hidden Forces, you can join our premium feed and listen to the second hour of today's episode by going to hiddenforces.io/subscribe. All of our content tiers give you access to our premium feed, which you can listen to on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this wonderfully educational and enlightening conversation with my guest, Anne Stevenson-Yang. Anne Stevenson-Yang, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
Thanks, Demetri. Thanks for having me.
It's great having you on. And this is your third appearance. You were one of my very first guests on the show, my first guest to talk about China back when I knew nothing. I still know nothing, but I know almost something.
You know a lot.
Right. So I'm very excited to talk to you. You're out, or you're going to be out. What is it, April 1st? You have 2 books publishing. Is that the correct date?
Yeah, that's right. The publisher thought that it would be good to have them both out at the same time. One is a nonfiction called Wild Ride about China, and the other is fiction short stories called Hello Kitty.
Yeah, so as I was telling you, I read Wild Ride, a really, really, really awesome book, and we're going to have a chance to talk about it. I didn't have a chance to finish Hello Kitty before this conversation, but I recommend both of them. I had a chance to read a little bit of Hello Kitty, and it looks like a fantastic book. It almost feels a little bit like Black Mirror for China. I didn't read enough to really get it, but is that a good summary of some of what you talk about in it?
Well, Black Mirror is future dread, and Hello Kitty is, hey, this is the present. It's actually more like, 2006 to 2010, something like that.
Wow. All right. So like I said, I'm super excited to get into this conversation, and I admire you as a thinker, as a researcher. I really do. Everyone I know in the investment community who follows your work, who relies on J Capital's research, has the best things to say and always has. So it's really great to have you on the show. Before we get into the book and into the story of China's rise and decline, which is what Wild Ride is about, which also parallels your experience. I mean, you moved to China in 1985 and you officially left in 2019. You had an intention to return, but COVID kind of squashed that. Before we get into that, I would like to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about you and your story. First of all, where did you grow up? And, What attracted you to want to move to China in 1985?
I grew up in Washington, D.C. I went to an all-girls parochial school, and I was the kid who had Mao Zedong's Little Red Book in my blazer pocket, which I'm sure was really obnoxious at the time. And, I really admired the guy. I thought he was the one socialist revolutionary who understood the peasant. I had a lot of kind of romantic ideas about China, and I wanted to see it for myself. So I went there, and it took me a day to be disabused of those ideas.
Would you say that you were part of the New Left? What would it have been called? What were the cultural cross currents in America at the time that you were part of?
I grew up in the 1970s, and I already felt like I had missed the New Left, that everything was about commercialization of those ideas, bell bottoms and flowers and free love and stuff like that, and kind of really bad music by people like the Carpenters. And, I wasn't really part of any political movement. I just had those views.
What did your parents say when you told them that you were going to move to China? First of all, how did that even come up for you? Did you have a job? Did you move without a job? How did that whole thing happen? And what did your parents say when you told them?
Yeah, I was working at newspapers in New York and Westchester County. I was an editor on the night. Actually, I guess I'd moved down to New York City. I was reporting on politics there and working at Business Week at night in order to make ends meet. And I kind of thought, I'll go to China and get a skill, learn a language, and I'll probably be more employable. Because, the early 1980s, journalism was already dying as a field.
So how did you put that plan into action? How did you go from now might be a good time to move to China to actually doing it?
Yeah, so I worked a night shift at Business Week, and we came out on Wednesdays. So on Tuesdays, the desk had to work a double shift. So we got 2 hours off for dinner. So I just left, and Business Week is based in New York City. I just walked downtown on Fifth Avenue, and I came to China Books and Periodicals. So I just went in and kind of on a whim bought all of the magazines and wrote to all of them, all of the people on the masthead, and said, hey, would you like to hire me? And then I kind of forgot about it. And that would have been spring. And in sort of September, October, I got a telegram, and it said, go to the embassy for an interview. So I go to the Chinese consulate in New York, and I'm sitting there. It's kind of I don't know if you remember this scene from War and Peace where Pierre and his going to ask his girlfriend to marry him. And they're kind of sitting quietly and awkwardly in this room, and there's the sound of water dripping behind them. So that's what it was kind of like. I was sitting with this Mr. He, and I was thinking to myself, what? They don't have vowels in Chinese? Mr. He, what's He? Is that a name? And he's sitting in this big chair, and there's this huge, painting of cranes behind him, and he keeps pouring me tea. And I have to get to work at 2 p.m. or whatever it was, and I really have to pee, but I don't dare leave. So he keeps on pouring me tea because, I feel like it's a job interview. It's not my position to leave. He feels like he's talking to a foreigner, so I'm the one who should take the initiative. So we both sit there awkwardly, not really saying anything and drinking this jasmine tea. That's about all I remember of it. And then, took about a week, and they gave me a visa and a plane ticket and said they'd put me up. And I figured, why not? Give it a shot.
So I remember, this is something I've talked about a few times on the show. I remember Brent Scowcroft describing his experience as part of the Nixon delegation that went to China in 1972. I remember hearing his description of China. He described it as alien. Actually, he has this great description of Mao smoking cigarettes. And Barbara Walters also in her biography talks about how in her hotel when she would use Kleenexes, they put the Kleenexes back on her bed. It was this weird experience. But everything that I have read, maybe you can tell us what that might have been about, but everything I've read or heard about China in the 1970s was really that it was this alien world. You moved to China during the early years of Deng Xiaoping's administration, which was, China opening to the world, becoming more capitalist. What was China like when you got there in 1985?
So it really hadn't opened up yet. So it was like walking into a black and white film. Everything was much more austere, much more quiet. The only sounds on the streets were the sounds of bicycle tires swishing along. When there was a movie in the movie theater, kind of near my house in an alley behind my house, then you'd hear all these people hawking as they rode their bicycles. But that was the only sound. When I got to the airport, people met me. I had tried really hard to memorize ni hao, hello on the plane, but I was scared to use the tone. So I just said hello. And, and the people who met me, I later learned, described me as like a little mouse who wouldn't say anything. And they put me in the car and they drive me down the airport road, which at the time was not a highway. It was this 2-lane willow-lined road, but there were no cars except for official cars. So we're sort of going down this quiet road. There are a few bicyclists on the side, and they drive me to this hotel, and it's all very quiet and austere and mysterious on tree-lined roads. So it wasn't until, 86, 87 that the country started to sort of explode into color. And you started to get all of these new clothes and fruits in the market and people starting to drive cars and all that sort of thing.
What did it feel like to live in an atmosphere with that kind of rapid development?
Well, at first it felt very kind of scary because I was aware that I was being watched wherever I went. I was very conspicuous as a foreigner in China. And so, all I had to do, you want to go outside when you're in a foreign country and just not be noticed, right? But everybody would like turn around and maybe try to talk to me. If I'd go into a store, then everybody would sort of be quiet and separate. And they started to have dances at the universities, which are a little bit north of where I lived. So I would go there on Saturdays and I'd walk into the room where they were having dances and the music would stop and everybody would sort of part and look at me and then start applauding and saying, disco, disco, disco. And then I would have to pretend I knew how to dance disco. So it was very, you really stood out as a foreigner.
I mean, how rare was it to encounter other people from Western countries in China at that time?
It was pretty rare. I mean, I lived in a compound. They corralled foreigners into separate compounds then. So in the compound where I lived, it was kind of like an island of lost souls. There were all these people who had washed up from the shores of revolutionary movements elsewhere. So there were, Sendero Luminoso from Peru. There were people who had been exiled by the generals from Argentina. There was a guy who was supposed to be a Nazi who had left Germany after the war. There were all sorts of, there's this guy who had been in North Korea because he was very, very far leftist. He was a Shining Path guerrilla from Peru. And he had actually gotten kicked out of North Korea because he had been correcting the memoirs of Kim Il-sung. And it said, Kim Il-sung did this, and then Kim Il-sung did that. So this guy, Mito, crossed out the name of Kim Il-sung and wrote he. Kim Il-sung did this, and he did that. But it turned out you can't cross out the name of Kim Il-sung. You have to draw a bubble around it. So he got kicked out of North Korea, and he came to China, which he considered a revisionist, a capitalist path place. But, he didn't have a choice.
So, Anne, at the beginning of this conversation, I gave a brief description of what your book is about. To flesh that out more, I would describe it as a history of China's economic miracle, as I said, seen through the eyes of someone who actually lived through those changes firsthand. First of all, is that a fair description of the book? Yeah,
I think it is. It was sort of an explosion of growth in the 1980s, and now it's all shrinking back and going back to the way it was, like a film run backwards, right?
So if you were to summarize the story of China's rise, of the economic miracle that has been China from 1979 until the ascendancy of Xi Jinping to the positions of PRC president and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, how would you describe it? What is the story that you would tell?
Well, there are differences among the decades. So the first decade of opening was one of just explosive and exciting growth when all of a sudden people were earning, my husband, when I married him, earned 60 renminbi per month. And he was pretty senior at that organization. We ran into people in the later 1980s who earned 1,000 renminbi a month. And that
what
was
are those figures
stunning.
In dollars?
So 60 renminbi now is about $10. At the time, depends on which exchange rate you use because they had two different currencies. But at that time, it was about around $8, $7 per month. And, people were earning 10, 15, 20 times that much in the free market. Originally, you could only buy blue or green clothes. And then suddenly there appeared these free markets where you could get like hand knit sweaters in all these different colors. And there was a sort of explosion of different organizations of art. And then came the 1989 protests. And that was a real watershed. And after the protests and the suppression, China became very sort of dark and austere for a few years. And then the central government worked very hard to improve their reach over local governments and over the regions so that they could control things. But they also poured money on the country. So that was the first sort of gate. And then the 1990s, there was so much investment, and in the early 2000s as well, that everything just sort of grew really, really fast. It sort of metastasized. But people got a lot more, I would say, less hopeful in a way, but more mercenary. So people realized that they could make a whole lot of money if they got on this bandwagon and, got into a private company and picked up on the growth, but they no longer had the same hope for the growth of the arts or, self-expression. And then I would say the next critical point was 2009, right after the global financial crisis, when China got sort of terrified that its own banks would seize up and not be able to transact. And so they just issued massive amounts of money. And that's when the real estate boom really, really took off.
So I'd love to actually get into each of these decades, because one of the things that I love about the book is the way you methodically go through those 40 years roughly and explain how Beijing's leadership and the economy in general began to open up, how they went from this very closed economy with price controls, et cetera, to what we have experienced in the last, few decades. You write in the book about how the quest for hard currency, specifically dollars, drove everything else, including, most importantly, the development of an export-driven economy. And apparently, this became clear to Deng Xiaoping and his delegation when they first visited the United States in 1979. And they realized that in the entire country, they could only find $38,000 to pay for the trip. And apparently that realization was instrumental in terms of steering Chinese policy out of the gate in 1979. First of all, how well known is that story and how true is it? I mean, is it really that true that they really couldn't find dollars and they realized this is the most important thing we need right now, because if we don't have dollars, we can't do anything else. So we need to build an export economy so we can actually get dollars.
Well, that story comes from a book by Fraser Howey and Carl Walter. So I took it from them. I have no way to verify it independently. It's believable because China had and has a soft currency that can't be used internationally. And they didn't really have much export business to speak of. So how were they going to get hard currency into the country? So the idea that the central bank only had that amount of money is plausible.
So how did economic policy in China adjust as a result of this realization? What were the first steps taken?
Well, they realized that they needed more hard currency and they also needed more economic development. But there was at least a very large faction in the Politburo that was concerned about what they called spiritual pollution by having foreigners mix with Chinese and bring in foreign ideas and perhaps revolutionary ideas and so on and so forth. So the compromise that Deng Xiaoping reached was to seal off 13 cities physically from the rest of China. And then Chinese people could go there to work in the factories, but they had to show documents in order to get in, and they had to have a particular type of job. And foreigners also had to show passports. So it was kind of a solution of hermetic sealing off from the rest of the mainland, with the idea that, okay, these areas would be able to export and earn money, but they wouldn't pollute the rest of China.
So those were the special economic zones, correct? Like Shenzhen, for example, in Guangdong province?
Yeah, they were called open cities. The special economic zones were part of that too.
So what were some of the instruments or tools used in those zones to try and bootstrap this? I mean, it's not, like you say, it's not a capitalist economy. It's almost like China has like a capitalist API that they use to interface with the rest of the world, but somehow they still maintain their own system.
I think that's a great analogy. I really like that. I always feel like it's kind of a lighted stage that capitalists are kind of ushered onto, and then there's a spotlight on them. But in the audience, in the dark theater is mainland China. So how did they maintain that? First of all, they had this separated currency. So foreign people had to use the foreign exchange certificate and domestic people used the renminbi. The foreign exchange certificate, the exchange rate was, I think, 3 to $1, and the renminbi was more like 8 to 1. But foreigners were supposed to use the foreign exchange certificate. They opened these cities where foreign companies could come and have factories, but they had to commit to export 100% of their product, and they had to have markets for it. So basically, they'd export to themselves. So if you were a company that made, I don't know, blue jeans, then you would make the patterns in China and sew them halfway up and then send them to the US. So that way, the US company would pay the Chinese factory in hard currency, and the Chinese factory would get money. At the time, the foreign trade was monopolized through state-owned companies, and the prices of inputs were fixed. So Chinese people didn't have a whole lot of incentive to build these companies. And, gradually that and other systems were found to be sort of hampering incentive, and so gradually had to fall away.
What was China's media landscape like at this time?
So China had and has a media that's entirely controlled by the government. But in the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure and incentive to start developing more, circulation-based media and advertising-based media. And so they found these kind of loopholes in the law. Like, for example, I ran a newspaper that was technically the weekend edition of a newspaper that was licensed by the Heilongjiang government. So we were technically a publicly owned newspaper, but, in reality, I ran it. So that's the kind of thing that they did. What happened was, under those rules, the number of newspapers, magazines, TV stations, and so on just exploded, and the number of regulators didn't. So they had this system of one regulator per publication who would then read everything before it was published, but it got to be too much for them. So they had to figure out different regulations.
So earlier you mentioned Tiananmen Square. When I had been learning about China as a college student, one of the common phrases was mandate of heaven, that the Chinese culturally are maybe not acclimated to democracy. But during the 1980s, there was obviously a sort of political awakening based on not just your recounting, but the recounting of others who lived in China or have reported on it. How amenable were the Chinese during the 1980s to the kind of liberal democratic ideas that we have here in the West during this period of opening economically?
I guess I would say first that I think it's an illusion on the part of the West that democracy goes hand in hand with liberal, or that economic opening goes hand in hand with liberal democracy. There was a lot of pressure to liberalize the systems, and that definitely happened. For example, right after Tiananmen, they made a new labor law that allowed people to leave their places of employment and migrate as long as, migrate for employment. And they had to change a whole, overhaul the system of surveillance. And it really set free sort of 300 million people to start migrating to the coast, to coastal factories to work. So it was definitely very freeing. But the idea of having a whole new system of governance, I don't know. I think that the idea of the mandate of heaven is also a little bit overused. This is really just sort of a last-ditch idea where basically you say, oh, well, if everybody rises up and the government can no longer hold, then it can no longer hold. Well, that's kind of obvious to begin with. But, that did start to happen in the late 1980s. And I think that the Chinese government looked over at Russia, the USSR at the time, and really got afraid.
So how important was that, the context of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, in the history of Tiananmen Square? And to be clear, when I say the history, I mean the protests that engulfed Beijing from the spring of 1989 until the massacres of June 4th and their aftermath. What was the atmosphere like in the months leading up to Tiananmen, and how long did the crackdown last after the massacre in the square on June 4th?
So the breakup of the USSR was super important in this. During the run-up to the Tiananmen Square incident, when there were lots and lots of people in Beijing protesting, Gorbachev was actually visiting Beijing. And shortly afterwards, the Soviet Union broke up, and China had all sorts of papers coming out of think tanks about the so-called color revolutions and how China should avoid this and how it would just be chaos if China went the way of Russia. They were really quaking in their boots. And certainly people the world over were also looking at this. How long the crackdown lasts? I mean, I would say sort of 3 years maybe.
Wow,
where
really?
It was
that long?
really, yeah, I mean, there was first the military crackdown and the sort of effort to chase down people and frighten them with, arrest and being disappeared and things like that. And then there was a sort of cultural chill. And then there was a long effort to end independent organizations and make sure that China's government controlled the media and controlled, channels of communication, that people weren't gathering without prior approval, things like that. So that basically it lasted quite a while. And after that was when the government went on, under Zhu Rongji, who was the premier at the time, went on it was an amazing effort to reform and change every governmental system so that they had better control over labor, over customs and tax collection, over the movements of people around the country, over appointments, over banking, everything.
So is it fair to say that the lesson that the leadership learned was that they need to have much tighter control over China economically and politically in order to avoid having happen to them what happened to the USSR? And that was the primary concern that drove policy from that point forward?
Yeah, I think so. I think that you have to look at it as central versus local, too. So during the 1980s and early 1990s, when Li Peng was the premier, he was a kind of anything goes type of guy. And so all the localities just kind of let go and grew as fast as they possibly could. And the center felt that it was losing control. So a lot of the efforts, the regulatory efforts from, say, 93 through 98 were all about gaining more control. And the amount of money and control that went to the center versus the provinces, I think, has a legacy that's become very, very negative for China now.
So you returned to Washington in 1988, and then you went back to China in 1993. Did you already have your job at the U.S.-China Business Council before you left for China?
Yeah, in 93, that's right. So in 88, we just, I was married then. It was, as I mentioned, it was really stressful to be a foreigner, or let's say it was tiring, because everybody was always, looking at you and asking you to be a model for this or that. Also, I suddenly had to speak Chinese all the time, and Chinese can be very demanding. I mean, I married just around Spring Festival in China. So at Spring Festival, families gather. And, I remember going to this gathering of my husband's family. And, in China, you don't just say hello to people. You say everybody's title in rank order. So if you say, brother-in-law before you say mother-in-law, that's a big no-no. And the titles are excruciatingly distinct. So, it's like mother's younger brother's wife is one thing, and father's older brother's wife is a different thing. And you have to remember all these things. And I just remember going to one of these gatherings right before we were married. And I was asking my husband, so what do I call your mother? And he said, why don't you call her Bomo? Because that's a respectful title for older women. But I couldn't say it because it's too close to Baomo, which means maid, housemaid. And I was really afraid I'd make a mistake, so I didn't say it. And as we're leaving, he's elbowing me and saying, say it, say it, say it. And I can't. So I got really tired, and I was like, Zhifeng, we got to go back to DC for a little while.
It's so impressive that you have lived this life, because you are such an introvert. And it's amazing that you're a quiet person. You're not a very, boisterous. I don't even know if, you're one of those people that gets drained by too much socialization, but somehow you find yourself taking on what is truly like, it takes a lot of courage to go live in a foreign country, marry a person from that country, and have to manage all of this. I mean, that must have been really, really intimidating.
Let's just say it was tiring, and you're absolutely right. I find it tiring to be in groups, and I like to be alone.
Yeah. So I said that the job you took when you went back to China was to work at the U.S.-China Business Council. First of all, what was this? And what did you learn while you were working there about how the mechanics of the Chinese economy worked at the time?
Oh my gosh, it was so interesting. When I took the job, I was feeling like, oh, I'm such a loser. I've been a failure at journalism. I'm going into business. Because, I grew up in Washington. Nobody I know was in business. I don't know what, I didn't know what a finance director was. I never heard of marketing, So going into business was something that I thought was really not very high status. But when I took the job, it's an investment association. And so all of these like company executives would sort of make a 40-minute slot while they were in Beijing to come see me and tell me about their businesses. And it was just fascinating because you learn all this stuff. I mean, people are not going to tell you this when you're a journalist, but when you're sitting there in an investment association and you have the responsibility to keep it private, then executives will just sit there and say, oh, I don't know what to do with my joint venture because blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, taking notes, trying to understand what an oil company does or what a chemical company does or what the hell, Ford Motor Company is, taking notes. And it was really a fascinating. So that's on the foreign side. On the Chinese side, there was very little, there was a small group of people who were remaking all of China's laws and regulations, and they were basically trying to do it from scratch. So, it was like tabula rasa. There are people in the US who get whole PhDs on, the 401k system or something. But in China, there was nobody to study the whole system of labor that was being promulgated in 1995. So I did that, and I'd go and meet with all the labor ministry people, and they'd tell me, well, there's this problem and that problem. It was really fascinating.
So I did an episode years ago around the time that you were first on the show with Bill Browder, whose company Hermitage Capital was one of the foreign, maybe the very first foreign firms into Russia that participated in the privatization. How did the privatization of Russia, of the USSR, post the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, compare to the privatization of China during this period?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that it's quite different because of the different nature of the economies and the size of the elites. But it was also something that the Chinese were very anxious about and concerned about. So the Chinese government was very determined that the government should hold on to the key assets, the money-earning assets. So in most countries, the government will operate the assets that are not money earning, like schools and hospitals, because those are key public services or water utilities or whatever. But in China, they held on to things like the oil monopoly and the tobacco monopoly and the telecom services and petrochemicals, things that were, very, very profitable. And they sold off the stuff that was not profitable to private investors.
Interesting. So the next big seismic event after Tiananmen Square was the Asian financial crisis. What effect did that have on China's economic development path?
The Asia financial crisis was kind of a preview of what happened in the global financial crisis. So initially, the leaders in Beijing were very anxious about this, and as a sort of matter of bravura, pushed a lot of money into the economy and made sure that China looked like it was going to be immune to the Asia financial crisis. In 98, though, all of the investments or not all of them, but an awful lot of the investments that had been driven out of Beijing started to collapse. And that began the financial crisis, the banking crisis that was only resolved in 2002 and at great cost to the economy.
So what did Beijing do to try and insulate itself from future economic shocks after the Asian financial crisis? And what was the period like between that period, let's say 2000 or 2002, after 1998, which was the Asian financial crisis, to the 2008 financial crisis? Like, you described them as the go-go years. What was that period like, and what did economic planners in China do to try and insulate themselves from any kind of future instability?
Well, the key event was the banking crisis, which was resolved by basically just, buying out all the bad assets and pouring money on the economy. So all of a sudden, there was this massive outflow of cash. At the same time, China joined the WTO in 2001, and so it had all of these trade outlets. So China was just kind of exploding with growth, and this was a period when people started to feel like they ought to do whatever they could to get into a listed company and make money while it lasted. And it was kind of, you don't really want to make a moral equivalence here, but it was kind of like drug money. It was like, oh my God, suddenly I have $2 million. I better spend it on 10 Rolls Royces,
Was this the period of greatest fraud and corruption in China's economic history?
I'm not sure whether we can have a greatest.
When I say, sorry, what I mean, it's post-1979 history.
Even so, yeah, I mean, the amount of money that was flowing around certainly encouraged people. I would say that the key fraud that we noticed here in the US really took off after Chinese companies started to list in the US. So this would have been, post-2009.
So the Beijing Olympics, I just kind of realized this now. The Beijing Olympics were in 2008. They were in the summer of 2008. And the crisis really peaked in the early fall, but there were tremors already present in the summer of 2008. So my question was going to be, how did Chinese leaders view and interpret the 2008 financial crisis, and how did that event, or what conclusions did they draw from it? But I guess we can sort of use that also as a jumping off point to talk about how it related to the 2008 Summer Olympics in Beijing and what you learned from those two experiences about the impact they had on thinking in China.
So the preparation for the Olympics, which was really almost, it was actually sort of crazy how much money and planning went into the Olympics. And I think that period, because there was so much money going in, and because people were very sort of distracted, or at least leaders were distracted by the Olympics, it hid a lot of what was happening in exports, particularly in tech exports, which were in decline, but people didn't really notice it very much. Culturally, Beijing became a much more controlled and cold place, not just Beijing, but across the country. So, the Olympics were really organized as a show to demonstrate to the rest of the world that China was rising and China was, very important, and China had deep cultural roots and so on and so forth. But actual Chinese people were not welcome to participate in the Olympics, and certainly people who lived in Beijing, couldn't drive on certain roads, couldn't attend the events, had to stay inside during the practices, and all of society became much more controlled. And I found it very distasteful and took the opportunity to take a holiday in the US with the family.
Right. I heard you went to San Francisco.
Yeah, among other things. I swapped houses with friends in San Francisco and then, drove through Wyoming and Colorado and the West.
Not a bad trade. So there's a great there are a lot of sections in the book that are fantastic, that are very quotable. There's this one that's rather long that I want to quote now that is from the section where you talk about the 2008 Olympics. And you're right. Increasingly, it became evident that the replica cities and the stage-set Olympic Games were creations of a frayed DNA, one that produced dysplastic growths that serve no purpose for the body as a whole and, in fact, represent a danger to its survival. They are overgrowth of a development model well past its prime. The replica wonders bear unimpeachable witness to the last throes of a growth model that must change to something slower and more sustainable. But whatever plans had been made to make China's growth more sustainable were knocked out of their guardrails by the global financial crisis. All of a sudden, concern about the health of the nation was tossed aside, and China grew laser-focused on avoiding financial collapse. How did the leadership respond to the 2008 financial crisis, and how did that response produce the economic realities that the country is dealing with today?
So at the time of the economic crisis, Beijing leaders were looking across the world and seeing how, Bear Stearns collapsed, and There were, stockbrokers in New York who were carrying their things home in boxes, and the banks were afraid that they would, not be able to guarantee deposits. And they were terrified that this would also happen to them and that their export markets would fall apart as well. So they decided to drive growth domestically by investing in the infrastructure and property markets. So they issued a call to the provinces in October of 2008, and within 2 weeks approved something like 24 trillion renminbi worth of projects that all of these provinces had sort of in their back pockets. Like, oh, wouldn't it be nice to build a roller drome? Oh, wouldn't it be nice to build a, huge bookstore or something like that? So they had all these plans. So they just tossed them up to Beijing, and Beijing was like, yes, we'll invest in this. And then they printed all this money and started to invest in these things. And so growth really, really took off. But growth of this, as I say, dysplastic nature, where, like cancer, where you have, wild growth of cells, but it's not healthy growth. It's cells that kill other cells.
So is this the origin of the real estate bubble and the industrial overcapacity that in part led to Belt and Road?
It's not the origin of it, but it's where it sort of took hormones and grew into sort of a golem. So the origin of it really lies with the post-Tianamen reorganization of the taxation system, where localities gradually were impoverished and the central government gradually captured more tax. And the localities are not allowed to make their own budgets in China. So the China Development Bank came up with this great idea, which is, hey, you can collateralize land because local governments own land, and you can borrow money. So they started to do that. At the same time, housing was privatized in 1998. And there started to be a private market for housing. So there were other factors as well, but those were the key ones, the ability of localities to borrow money and the privatization of housing. So it really started to take off. But then in 2009, it was like pouring kerosene on a forest fire.
So I remember in like 2011 or 2012 where investors like Hugh Henry and Jim Chanos were not only short China's real estate sector, but they were actually going out of their way to tell everyone about what a monumental bubble it actually was. And I could swear I remember seeing videos of Hugh Henry touring ghost cities to make the point that were circulating on YouTube. How much bigger is the problem today? And what's become of these ghost cities?
Well, it's pretty big. I mean, independent analysts pretty much can't travel around the country anymore, so you can't really see it. But, reports say that there are 20 million apartment units that have not been completed because people would buy apartments the way Americans buy bonds or buy mutual funds. So they'd buy them 2 years ahead of the construction completion, and they would expect them to appreciate in value. So they would be buying these things as, a holder of value, because Chinese people don't really, trust the banks, and they saw lots more appreciation come out of real estate. So they would pre-buy all these apartments when they were just plans. So the thing is that the cash cycle kind of choked in 2021, and these builders kind of ran away with the deposits that they'd received. So there are these people all over China who are paying mortgages on apartments that are just cement shells, and they don't know what to do. So that's one problem. Another problem is all these ghost cities, like, the replica cities, like the little Manhattans, the little Hong Kongs, the little Florence, the little Paris, as if you could build these replica cities and somehow have the actual thing because you have the representation.
So help me understand this, how serious this problem actually is, because the 20 million empty or unfinished units doesn't really say anything to me because I have no context for it. I mean, I guess that's something like 40 to 60 million people worth of housing units if you assume 2 or 3 people habitate a home. But I don't really know what the equivalent would have been in the United States. And also China has a much bigger population. So how bad actually is that?
So there's a little exercise that you can undertake if you happen to go to China, which is that you drive your car along any highway and you get off on any exit and you roll down your window and you ask anybody who's passing by, hey, where's the new city? And that person will point, and then you will go to whatever it is, new city that local government has built, and it will be 80% empty. So that's absolutely everywhere in China. So, what's the macroeconomic impact? I can come up with some numbers, but it's really hard to give a tactile sense of what it is, except I do feel that Chinese people, I'm sure Jim Chanos felt this way when he was walking around China. And, many, many people I know did who were, walking around China in like 2012, 2013, and looking at these huge towers that are dark and empty and cold, and the cement is kind of crumbling. And, you ask a passerby, hey, who lives in those places? Because, they're all sold. And the person will say, oh, yeah, they're occupied, just that everybody's out. So you feel like people had this, they all participated in this delusion for quite a while. And there were places like I remember this complex in the middle of Henan, which is hog area where they raise hogs for pork. And it's kind of dusty, and there are all these like cicada tractors that are driving around with these long tails going tick, 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 tick. And people, guys driving the tractors with those hats with flaps that go up, So it's really not a very modern looking place. And in the middle of this town in Henan, there's this big complex of, I forget which developer, but they have pictures on the outside posters of the future development. It's going to have pavilions and brooks and palm trees, which really don't fit in the Henan weather. And people are walking past this and thinking, yes, someday I too will live in what is more or less like Miami, right? And now I feel like people are having the scales come off their eyes, and they look around them and they see, oh, actually, these places are all empty, and it's still the China that it was 10 years ago.
I'm really curious to understand what that does to people's psychology, because we've seen how the reverse of this, which has had the same effect, the deindustrialization of Middle America, what effect this has had on people. It's coincident with rising rates of depression, anxiety, and drug use. In this case, in China's case, you actually had you sort of had people through this giant centrifuge of real estate creation. You had people being moved from the agricultural communities that they were living in and had ties in to these cities that are really not sufficiently developed and therefore don't have the same kinds of commercial districts and vibrant businesses that you would normally find. So what effect has it had on people's psychology?
Yeah, that's a really good connection to make and very thoughtful. And you think also about what's going to happen to China's crime rates and to its politics, because there's been all of this dislocation. Not only that, but people have lost their livelihoods. So there's so many towns and cities where the local government said to people, hey, why don't you sell me your farmland? And I'm going to build this tower on a small piece of the land. And, isn't it great? You're going to become an urban person. So you no longer have to farm barley. And now you can be a janitor in this building. You can be an elevator operator, whatever it is. And they would pre-fund maybe 2 years of salary for these people. Well, now those 2 years are gone. So what's happening to those people? So first of all, their kids left the schools where they knew people. Secondly, they left the areas where they knew neighbors and that were familiar to them. And third, they lost their livelihoods. So what is it like? I mean, that's why these stories, and they are kind of dark, I think, but that's why trying to sort of poke at that and figure out how people feel in this country of sort of vast anomie.
Well, what conclusions have you come to in terms of how people feel? Like what effect it's actually had and how it's changed the mood since you lived there?
Well, I mean, people are pretty depressed. They don't see a future for themselves. They're very anxious about what's going to happen. A lot of people have tried to emigrate, but emigration has become more difficult. And people are just sort of sour. And also this sense of dislocation. I know not a few people who sold their apartments in sort of city centers and moved out to some region which has not become occupied, where it takes them, an hour to get back into the city to see their friends. And they've got to feel lonely and dislocated.
So, Anne, I want to move us to the second hour, and that'll give us a chance to talk about the Xi Jinping era and the period of wolf warrior diplomacy, I also want to understand the effect that COVID had on the psychology of the Chinese and how it also maybe gives us a sense of where the internal politics of China are going. And that is also a good opportunity to talk about the social credit system, what they call the Sesame credit system, and how systems like this are used in China and maybe what parallels we can draw for what's happening here in the United States, because we are also having conversations here about social media, sort of the surveillance state, et cetera, conversations I've also had on this podcast. And then I want to talk about China's political and economic future. You know, we touched on, I guess, some of this now in terms of the comparison with the fentanyl crisis and what's happening in the middle of the country in the U.S. I wonder if what we're seeing in China maybe, like what China will look like in 5 or 10 or 15 years, you know? I'm curious to ask you about that in the second hour. For anyone who is new to the program, Hidden Forces is listener supported. We don't accept advertisers or commercial sponsors. The entire show is funded from top to bottom by listeners like you. If you want access to the second hour of today's conversation with Anne, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and sign up to one of our 3 content tiers. All subscribers gain access to our premium feed, which you can use to listen to the rest of today's conversation on your mobile device using your favorite podcast app, just like you're listening to this episode right now. And stick around. We're going to move the rest of our conversation onto the premium feed. If you want to listen in on the rest of today's conversation, head over to hiddenforces.io/subscribe and join our premium feed. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, you can also do that through our subscriber page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter at Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.